Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Slang, and I'm the Membership and Business Development Associate at Digital, and I am pleased to welcome you to our webinar this morning, Navigating the Complexities of Data Sharing Responsibly and Ethically. Before we get started, we respectfully acknowledge that in Canada, we live, work, and learn on the unceded traditional and ancestral land of Indigenous people. As myself and much of the Digital team are based in Vancouver, British Columbia, we are gathered here on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are joining us from. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all of the attendees afterwards. And if at any point during the session you do have a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A and we'll address them at the end during the Q&A portion. And now I will pass it off to Jen.
Thank you so much, Ben. Bonjour, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to have attendees joining in from across the country for this month's webinar. Whether you're a new or returning participant to Digital's IP series, we're thrilled that you could join us for this Thought Leadership Power Hour. Next slide, please. In today's interconnected digital landscape, leveraging data as a strategic asset is a defining characteristic across industries and organizations of all sizes and of all sectors. Failure to properly address the unique considerations related to data use and sharing from the outset can result in significant operational roadblocks, liability, and reputational damage. Recognizing these challenges prompted Digital to look more broadly at data practices and data stewardship. And in consultation with industry thought leaders, which are included in today's speakers panel, a resulting document was developed to provide organizations with a structured framework in navigating the complexities of data sharing, and to which they'll be speaking to today. Over these next 60 minutes, we'll walk through data licensing contract considerations from both a licensee's and licensor's perspective, the importance for organizations to be proactive and responsible in data collection and sharing, mitigating risks associated with data breaches and regulatory compliance, and best practices for establishing a data stewardship culture within your organization. And as Ben mentioned, a Q&A portion to close us out. Next slide, please. Fundamental to the global innovation clusters is collaborative innovation, setting the framework for projects that address cross-industry challenges whilst creating technology products and services that can scale across industries and ultimately across the world. Digital's IP strategy supports the development, ownership, and retention of Canadian IP through numerous vehicles, and informational sessions with thought leaders like we've today are one example of that. Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing today's panel. Please join me in welcoming Jade Buchanan, Paul Gagnon, and Misha Benjamin. Jade is partner at McCarthy Tétrault in the Cyber Data and Technology Groups, ranked by Chambers as an up-and-coming leader in privacy and data protection law, and recently recognized in the top 40 under 40 best of emerging leaders of data lawyers globally. He has worked on some of the largest cybersecurity incidents in Canadian history, has extensive experience advising in retail and technology sectors, public sector, and banking and financial services, and frequent speaker on technology, privacy, and cybersecurity. Paul is partner and technology and AI lead at BCF, bringing diversified experience in technology and commercial law and intellectual property. His expertise in IT sits at the cutting edge, and he's advised clients from startups to large-scale enterprises transitioning to AI. He was previously Assistant General Counsel with Tega Motors, as well as in-house counsel with Cirque du Soleil and Element AI, and named as one of the top 300 IP strategists in the world, and regular speaker on legal issues arising from AI, data licensing, and IP. And last but not least, Misha, General Counsel at SAMA, overseeing all legal aspects of the commercialization of their software and services for annotating training and production data for AI, including IP strategy and protection, and developed their ethical AI guardrails. Prior to that, he was Associate General Counsel for McKinsey & Company and at Element AI, where he was responsible for shepherding software from research to commercial deployment. He has spoken extensively on all issues related to IP, as well as on the intersection between IP and data. We are in for a treat today with our panel, and with that, Jade, I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jen. A little more than a year ago, this panel did a similar panel on data licensing, and I rewatched it this morning, as I do every morning, and it was speaking not on my own behalf, but for Paul and Misha, Paul and Misha did an excellent job. It was incredibly interesting, and despite being about 18 months old, is still very fresh. So that's available on Supercluster's website, Digital's website, sorry, digitalsupercluster.ca under resources. It's worth going back and watching. And one of the things that we were pleased to see is that there was a high level of engagement on that one. We had a lot of really great questions, and the Q&A, I believe, is up now. I will be paying attention to it as I cue Paul and Misha, and they provide answers and try to work in things that folks raise. So with that, get into some of the questions for Paul and Misha. I'll try to be fair and bounce between the two of you. I know there's some bad blood there. Hopefully people realize it's a joke. The first question I had for you, just kind of setting the table, is in a general sense, what are the considerations for organizations when they want to either license their data or they want to become licensees of data? And I frame that as, for a lot of us in our world, somebody brings a license agreement to you and says, we've decided we want to license this data. We think it's a great idea. Can you just check it over and make sure it's okay? If you're legal or you're a marketing team and you think this data is really going to improve your ability to reach your customers, and why are my lawyers being the hold up on this? So Paul, I'll put that one to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Jade. I find like one of the premises of your questions is very optimistic, in that the person bringing the question would have an actual license agreement for data, and I say that as I think it's a good image, right? So around AI, there's a lot of talk of the importance of having quality data, the value of data, and being able to unlock it. And as organizations kind of run towards projects like that, I think there's a lot of realizations that there's technical hurdles that I think Misha can speak to, and there's legal hurdles that are kind of the topic of this panel. As you get a question like this, can I use this data? An organization that wants to bring in data, I think it's kind of like any other asset that you're looking at, right? You want to make sure that the company can use it, and not just once, right? You want to be able to make sure you have continued access and legal clarity around being able to use that data. In a lot of cases, that's easier said than done. More often than not, teams will find data sets that are available, and the licensing terms sometimes aren't very clear. Sometimes there's no license at all. Sometimes, you kind of dig a little bit and teams realize that data was shared by a partner that may or may not have had the right to share it with them. So I think as a kind of starting reflection is, for people to realize that in a lot of cases, the origin of the data is not always that clear. And in turn, that might introduce a little bit of legal risk around, can it be used or not? Misha, do you want to spring off?
Yeah, a few things to add to that for sure. Like, in terms of Paul's setting that it'd be optimistic to have a data license, I think it's even sometimes optimistic for people to recognize when they actually are licensing data. And I think one thing that's changed a lot since the last webinar that we did is that, now more and more people are going towards generative AI tools, or, tools that may not be generative AI tools, but are offered by people who are creating generative AI tools. And so what someone might come with is not a data license, but rather, a product development license or an API agreement, and recognizing when that actually also has a data licensing aspect, and like that triggering a flag to say, okay, we have to ask all these other questions that go along with data licensing, because like that's actually what's happening here in addition to everything else is really important. So that's number one, is like the situations in which data licensing is happening have gone outside of the traditional, like, we have this information and we're going to give access to you for, like, because that's what we do, is we commercialize this. Like, we have to get those skills up a little bit in recognizing the scenario. And then the other thing is, do you really have to understand all the attributes of that data? So, where did all the data come from? Is it all from one place, or are there sort of multiple sources, and making sure that you're understanding the limitations that you had before you share on? But also, understanding what's going to be done with the data. Like, the days, like, it used to be, it was either you can use it or you can't. And what you're seeing a lot more now is you can use it in very specific ways, and you could process it under certain circumstances and certain instructions, even in certain geographies. So understanding what the use case really is, how else it might be used as part of that use case, and making sure that there's alignment between what's actually going to happen, or what you intend to happen, and how the data was collected, and how you said it was collected. And the other thing that I think is new in the last 18 months is we've seen a lot more enforcement and importance given around data subjects' sort of legitimate expectations around how data would be used. So even in the event of really wide, data use policies or privacy policies that allow, like, almost any use, what we're seeing is that if you're using it in a way that a reasonable customer wouldn't expect it to be, I think you have to be asking yourself some questions. There's reputational risk related to that. In the US, the FTC is being really aggressive about going after companies that, even if it's not in their privacy policy, said, let's say, we wouldn't use your data to train models, and then they're actually doing it in some way. So I think, like, matching not only the contract language on the, like, how do I have access to this versus how it's being used, but really looking at it globally in terms of expectations is really important.
It's a very interesting point, Misha, and I hope we'll pick it up as we talk about the privacy angle of licensing data when it's personal data. But in that case, it can even come down to your own data. You've collected it, but you're not using it in a way that you have the necessary consents to use it. Yeah.
And so, like, looking at, like, each source of that data and making sure you understand the limitations is really important. And then, same thing when you're looking at how it's meant to be used, you have to understand, okay, like, do they need ongoing access? Is this a one-time thing? How often does it have to be updated? Do I have the ability to update this data, and would that influence the use of it later on?
Yeah, and I think complementary to that, to kind of expand on Misha's point on the technology aspect of it, figuring out kind of the logistics of bringing data on board, right? Oftentimes, the teams will say, "Well, look, our projects, that's the kind of data we need for a project, AI or other, and these data sets, we can obtain them." But the question really becomes, what is that data pipeline? How are all these different threads being pulled together, either to train a machine learning algorithm or other kinds of AI solutions? And that is a technical challenge, but it's also like a governance and a commercial one, right? Because ultimately, if these are coming from different sources, you need to have a good technical understanding of how it all gets pulled together. And in turn, obviously, if there's 3 different sources with 3 different contracts, that technology architecture and how that data pipeline gets built has to reflect those contracts as well, right? So
I think, like, what I think Paul is highlighting is, like, even if it's not specified by contract, like, combining data sets can get really tricky really fast, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that complexity really of saying, look, there's, for this project to succeed, we need a bunch of different data sources. Well, like, and I know we're going to touch upon it a bit later, but, like, that spirit of organization, of understanding license terms, but also making sure that from a technical standpoint, that gets respected as well. That's, I think, a big challenge for organizations. You see it oftentimes with data licensors that are, that's their bread and butter is reselling data. And those contracts can get really quite restrictive and really say, okay, well, you're buying this data for this use case. and it's like really severely limiting to one use case, but then the teams may or may not be aware of these restrictions, find that data quite useful. This project then feeds into another, and you get 6 months, a year down the road, and what was initially thought to be one use case ends up being a different one for all the right reasons, but not always reflected in that initial agreement. So there's a bit of a risk there, because then if organizations try to anticipate that risk too much and overshoot it on the use restriction, especially with a commercial vendor, then the commercial vendor is going to say, great, no problem, and charge quite a bit of a markup for extremely broad use cases rather than not narrow ones. So there's definitely an art to that.
And I would say like that hygiene aspect is so important, and it applies both to data and to, especially when we talk about AI, like any models that are trained on that data, right? So I think what's really like a commonly accepted practice now is that if you have a use case, like a use case restriction on the data, that will generally apply to models trained on that data. But the model might not be stored in the same way or the same place as the data itself. And so making sure that you're flowing down any restrictions that apply to the model on like that specific piece as well. And that your code comments reflect that, and your storage reflects that. And you're able to sort of, like, conversely, if you're developing something similar, you're able to sort of trace back that, no, this was the version that was not trained on this particular data. Like, all of that hygiene is really important.
Yeah, and it's also true for data that's publicly accessible, and I use publicly accessible as opposed to open. So for those in the audience, just a quick clarification on that. When we speak about like open software, open source software, or open data, generally what that would mean is that it doesn't come with any restrictions, that it would usually be and accommodate a number of use cases and not come in with limitations like for research purposes or something like that. And so publicly accessible data might not be open data, right? So just because teams can access different data sets, it doesn't mean that the associated license allows them to use it in whatever way. So I think that, if there's one takeaway for those in the audience is just because you find it doesn't mean you can use it. And also I think there's a time component to that. Just because you found it once doesn't necessarily mean that you'll find it again, right? The availability of data can be shifty at times, and companies can decide to take data sets down, which means that if you have a local copy, odds are, if the license allows it, you can keep using it. But if you haven't pulled that local copy, if you haven't well documented under what license it was available, then down the road, if you're not able to show kind of clean hands on why and how you're using that data, I think is something to be aware of. So I think I think Misha's expression is data hygiene. I think that's a good expression. It's a good one to say. Look, like there needs to be a part. I have a really bad pun coming. Sorry, guys. You have to kind of work that data floss and just kind of make sure that it's all nice and tidy and well documented. And again, apologies for the pun.
In some ways, I find with data licensing, what is new, what is old is new again, in restrictions on use getting more and more narrow, and the risk that the vendor of the data, the licensor of the data, will audit you, and you'll find out actually you're using this for way more of a broader purpose, or across more machines, or whatever it might have been, than we authorize you to. And lo and behold, that's already been built into the contract. There's already an economic model built into what you can expect to pay for that. I think we'll jump back to high level again, and then we'll have a lot of details as we drill down. But I think it's really interesting for folks on the line to if we can talk about some of the cooler things that we're seeing, or some of the projects that you're seeing, maybe in the last 18 months that you can actually talk about, or unique challenges that you're seeing in the data licensing world. So I think, Misha, you get to go first this time.
The unique challenges, yeah. I mean, I think like one of the things that's really evolved is just how narrow things are getting, both on the like at every collection point or every point that another person is intervening, the use cases are getting more narrow, and the rights are getting more narrow, right? So privacy laws have really come in and mandated that whether it's like legal basis for processing data, or whether it's a consent, like that has to get more and more narrow. And having having the ability to track sort of all the different narrow restrictions that are sort of combining one on top of the other, and then you apply that with, let's say, narrower licenses, maybe on your open source model that's going to be used to train there. Like, we're just looking at a really different environment for how we have to contract around it, how we have to, like, to your point, like to your point about like the ability to audit, how we have to structure it so that it's easily auditable and we can really show that that we're complying with those. And then, you know, like the cost and the rights have really gone haywire in the last little bit as well, because data is just and like those, not many people know what those market terms look like. We have a few big players that are really you know, getting what they want out of this, and have been very aggressive in the like interpreting the rights in their favor, or even, you know, in using data in a way that you would not have expected originally. And I think like as those large players tend to do it, we're going to see like mid-market players think that they can do whatever they want. And so like being very, very directive when you're licensing this is very important. And one of the justifications for that, and one of the reasons you have to be careful, is like you probably have restrictions on the data that you have, even if you created it yourself. And so we're getting into very, like, I think both from the commercial aspect and the legal aspect, it's very narrow menu items that are being bought, right? And as you said, like Jade, you know, if you want another use, you're gonna have to pay for that specific use and contract around that specific use. It's not this broad use anymore.
Yeah. I mean, you know, Misha, you're summarizing your points is, look, here are commercial aspects and here are legal aspects that have changed. And I think the third one is the technical aspects are changing, have changed, and that those restrictions and those terms, the importance of understanding how they're managed from a technical standpoint by an organization, that's even more important than it ever was. And that shows, you know, if you're a legal professional, if you're a data science professional, it shows the importance of also like working with the other teams in your organization, you know, IT, architecture, whatever, to just make sure that you all have this common understanding of how this all actually fits together. Including, you know, as Misha mentioned, trained models, right? And making sure that they don't kind of scatter off and later become reused. So that's, you know, that has become quite more complex than it was before, but it's a good thing, right? That complexity comes with a better understanding, I think, about these issues, right? I mean, today's webinar is an example, right? I think there's interest in figuring out how to do this right. You know, as opposed to, I don't know, call it early days, 2017, 2018, when it was just kind of this feeling that whatever you could grab, you could create value out of, in the context of AI. And though the providers of large language models that you know, we know will have the capacity to more or less make value out of anything because of the way large language models are built, that's not the everyday players. That's not addressing a sizable part of what AI is. That being said, the emergence how much data is actually required. I think for industry, I think to focus on narrower use cases means that these restrictions and how you manage them becomes, manageable, right? It doesn't become this grand big scale where, organizations aren't going to try to, build another ChatGPT. What they're going to look for is, very specific use cases that they can contribute data to, and in turn kind of manage it in a more transparent way within the organization.
Yeah, I think
But I'm
that
curious,
transparent.
yeah.
No, like, and that transparency is really important, and I think has gotten so much broader, right? So, like, whereas in the past this was a question between the lawyer and like the technical team sort of handling the data and delivering on it. Now you have to make sure that your marketing knows, your executives know. Like, I think there's a really good example of the CTO at OpenAI giving a podcast and being asked about what they use to train their model, and like giving very evasive answers and non-complete answers, and getting some blowback from that. And so I think like it's now something that has to be on the radar of like all tech organizations or all organizations that handle large amounts of data. And like they have to be able to know both philosophically how they think about this and how they treat it, but also, I think in the details they have to be able to talk about how, like, what they use data for, what they don't, and what they allow other people to do. And it's just become like there's a spotlight on it that didn't exist before. And I think like taking that into account, also like taking the philosophical approach that your management wants and drilling that into the contracts is really important too. Because your management says, hey, we're never going to use X data in Y way, and you're not being really tight around those use cases, they might end up being surprised.
Transparency is on the privacy angle to it as well. Organizations are going to have to expect that if they're going to do things with personal data, they need to be transparent about it, obviously disclosing it in privacy notices, but transparency creeps up in other ways, for example, with data subject requests. So individuals, have a right to get subject to limitations, have a right to get a copy of their personal information, know who you've disclosed it to, correct it if it's incorrect. And that as a kind of evolved into a portability right that we've seen in Europe. We have it coming into force in Quebec next year, later this year, and is in potential federal legislation. I don't think one thing I'm seeing is that data subjects are making requests of one organization and learning their data has been shared with another organization. And suddenly they get very interested in, I didn't realize my data was being shared with that other organization, or I didn't realize that organization had shared my data with you, and you have that data. And it can be alarming for people when they don't fully appreciate what's going on. But they've, in theory, consented to it on day one, and always had it available to them to learn more about it. On transparency as well, when I'm working with an organization, if there's competing concerns within an organization, one of the questions I ask is, are you prepared to disclose that you're doing this? And that's usually a good litmus test for, is this the right thing for the organization or not? Is if we are, when the spotlight comes onto us, are we prepared to talk about it? Are we prepared to disclose it? Paul, you look like you have something to jump in on.
Yeah, I have you found from a privacy standpoint, like the expectations for that transparency, have you found that it actually now means to be more explicit, or in turn kind of more vague, right? Because it's hard to assume at the moment of collection like how granular you can be. But I'm wondering, like, from a practical standpoint, if you've seen that, like, is there a range of good approaches to this, or is it like, has that shifted a little bit in the last 2 years maybe?
No, it's an excellent question. So if you can frame the questions, when you're collecting personal information from people, you've got to disclose the purpose of collection, your purpose of use, and how broad do you do that? Do you say we're going to use this for research? Like that can be a massively broad phrase that could encompass research about you as an individual that you may not
or service
think.
improvement, right?
Yeah.
Which is the
Yeah,
classic
that's the classic. Yeah.
catch-all.
Yeah, and service improvement could be, monitoring uptimes or what times of day you're using the product so they can load balance to make sure it's available all the time. Or it could be, personalizing the service through the collection of sort of details you didn't expect were being collected, and so that they can serve up things that are tailored to you, but that means knowing a lot about you in order to do that tailoring. I don't think there's an easy answer, unfortunately. I think that the avenues that don't involve consent, I can talk about that a bit, are very useful here. It's ideal to be as explicit as you can and as clear as you can from a compliance perspective, but to your earlier points about the evolving nature of what you're doing with that data, if you try to have a privacy notice that is in detail, up to date with exactly how you're using each piece of data, which piece of data you're collecting down to the finest point, it'll be stale within a week. And so then you've got a policy that doesn't actually reflect reality, and you're kind of in a worse position by your attempts at transparency. But transparency is transparency is about telling the truth, but being kind of accurate. So if you're trying your best to be transparent, you can actually end up seeming like you're being withholding of information. So I don't tend to go to don't tend to go to a level that's more narrow than we need to, but making sure the organization understands that as requested, you got to be prepared to provide more details, and working on weaving disclosures into your organization. When this is maybe a good transition into informational governance and how to do what training you can do, how you do things on culture, because as people start to appreciate privacy more and more within organizations, they start to put themselves in the shoes of the individual providing information, start to get better at just-in-time notices of providing transparency, not just when the data is collected, but on an ongoing basis, and empowering people to exercise their autonomy over their data through controls and reminders and things of that nature. So you're being transparent, you're shaping their expectations, you're giving them more power, and finding, they're maybe more willing to share data for what we're doing than we realize, that they're actually, they're invested in what we're doing and they think it's a good use of data. So maybe with that, though, I will transition, Paul, if you've got thoughts on how organizations can work these data licensing concerns throughout their own sort of ecosystem for those cross-disciplinary teams that need to understand things like what limits we have on data, legal, technical, contractual.
Yeah. Well, first, I think the toolkit that'll be available shortly is a great I mean, obviously, we're biased because we all contributed to it. So obviously we're gonna be proud of it. But I think for organizations looking for what themes they should be addressing in those conversations internally, I think the toolkit's objective is to, kind of make those conversations happen, right? And I think it does so in a way that's quite clear and practical, to say, look, here are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves, and it's not that there's a right or wrong answer. It's just let's figure out these positions as an organization. And I think that conversation, I mean, as you said, right, it's a question of company culture around data, and culture doesn't happen, always, prescriptively, like top down. We need a data licensing culture. I think what's interesting to see in my work, I think what I like doing a lot is working alongside organizations first on a given project, and leaving those artifacts and those tools for then the organization to come to the next use cases and say, oh, well, we've kind of done this before. What's different this time? And, that culture kind of emerges from building that muscle, right? Of saying, okay, well, this is how we manage more difficult licenses. These are the kinds of measures that we put in place when we have use restrictions. And from there, you get, as an organization somewhere where you have concrete examples where you've exercised that muscle and you've built those tools and you've used them. And from there, I think that culture that's the culture, right? So, yeah, I know Misha has some thoughts on this too.
Oh, do I? No, no, but that's it. I think and I think we're in a really good moment here where the people that you're interacting with understand these concerns a lot more than a few years ago. And like bringing it back to how people would expect that their data is treated in general is a really good way to remind people like, okay, hey, this is really relevant. That's it. The toolkit is great. Is like the tool that we're putting out it's a good shortcut to having those conversations. And one thing that's really interesting about it is that it was developed before, the rise of generative AI. And I think it didn't need any changes because these are the right questions to be asking. The answers to those questions probably changed and will continue to change over time. But if you have people who understand the consequences and the importance of asking the right questions, I think that's really the important part. And then like, as Paul said, asking those questions leads to changing the practices over time about how we like talk about data and how we especially like store data and engineer around it and develop those hygiene practices. So I think it's really like, it starts with putting a spotlight on the importance of those questions and the importance of data, to people in general. Like I think in every organization, you're going to find people who are very concerned about this. Like, in our company, there's absolutely people who are constantly asking like, how are we using our personnel files? How are we using our customer data? Like, does it really, does it align with our values or not? And that's the conversation we're constantly having. And then all of these like smaller questions that are very practical stem from like making sure that we understand that as an organization, it is important to our customers and to our employees that we are doing this right. Like same thing. I mean, our customers are giving us, loads and loads of data, and it's sensitive data. It's data that they're going to be using to develop AI materials. And so, they have to have confidence that that is being used for their benefit only, and they're asking these questions. And we have to be very, very tight on our architecture because of it. So the more like across the ecosystem, the more that you're asking the questions that are in this tool, I think the rest sort of comes much easier. And obviously like the experts know the details about how to do it, but starting by asking those questions is really important.
Yeah, and I think vendor management, right, like is a great place to start. Understanding like your organizations have IT needs, and there's a range of vendors that offer solutions, and I think digging to understand what, if any, reuse of that data gets done and for what purposes, I think is key. And oftentimes, it was mentioned earlier, right? This right to improve the service. It's this was a clause that we used to see all the time, and no one really blinked that much at it because it was examples like the ones that Jade mentioned, where there were really objective, clear reasons why a cloud vendor would use the data to improve services. It made sense. Today, that meant, today, 5-10 years ago, it started meaning something different, where vendors would at times try to create additional value by using the data in ways that people didn't expect. And sometimes even by potentially collaborating with bringing that data to fruition on outright competitive products, right? So that expectation, is changed. And I think the organizations looking to make sure that to start that reflection is looking at vendors and making sure that when you're selecting them, that you have this kind of process to understand what gets done with data, what reuse gets done with data, and then from there, having mechanisms internally to say, well, whose call is it? Like, really, who's going to decide about this kind of stuff, and how are we informing that decision maker appropriately? And that's not just like spoken as a lawyer, that's spoken as an organization. That comes from an information security team, IT professionals, legal professionals, and whoever the business owner is for that, for that software that they're looking for, right? There could be a very important business need that isn't met, and the trade-offs around reuse of data could be worthwhile, but you have to have the right people around the table to have that discussion.
It's I spend a lot more of my job having conversations about data flows and who quote owns the data, is often the wrong phrase, but in a previous life that was only a few years ago, most situations it was pretty clear that we're a customer, we're turning our data over to you to process it for X purposes. We can say that in the contract, and we've got to, we can just use our data protection addendum, and that was fine. And now as combining data from multiple sources becomes critical, and it's not always, clear who the quote controller is. We're spending a lot of time investing in relationships that are no longer strictly controller service provider, even though that's how financially the relationship might be set up, especially where data is being pooled across multiple customers, and being you kind of got multiple different independent controllers having access to the same data sets, and things get really confusing when it's like one, for example, one controller says, okay, it's time to delete that data, and actually no, there's 6 other controllers who can't.
Dominoes, yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting point, right? Because this notion of controller and processor, for those in the audience, it comes from Europe's GDPR, and at the time where this notion was kind of devised, it was 2016, right? And then it came to force a couple of years later, but like ultimately at that point in time, it was a sound kind of premise to say, well, there's going to be one controller, one processor. There might be joint controllers at some point, and they'll figure it out amongst themselves. And then you look at, not 8 years later, and it's exactly as James describes, where all of this is kind of tangled web of data controllers and processors, and that dichotomy doesn't really work as well as anticipated.
Yeah, you can think of something as simple as ordering a meal on an app, which it used to be you would order it from the restaurant's app, and there was just one restaurant you're dealing with. Now it's a platform that you have a direct, who your platform is, you have a relationship with them, but also the restaurant, how much of that data they get, and how much of the insights derived from your behavior across multiple restaurants should be going to each of those restaurants. I think none, but it's an easy to digest simplification of much more complicated things that are happening in other sectors, especially health and financial services.
And I'm seeing there's a question in the Q&A actually, which is yes, the toolkit, like, I think is very helpful for startups in particular. I think it'll help you guide, really the questions you should be asking, where you should be focusing your time. So absolutely encourage that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, are there like startup specific data questions? It all depends on, like, if you're an AI startup, your strategy and how deep you're going to think about data is different than if you're, a consumer products organization that's more mature, right? Like, but yeah, what's interesting for startups is that, receiving investment means that there's going to be due diligence, right? So this is investors, opening up the hood and understanding how the company's been structured, how the company works, product strategy, all that, but also from a legal standpoint, how it's done. And I think for AI, investors have become savvy to this on, like, what is your data pipeline? What is your, like, is this a critical risk for you guys? Can you substitute data? What are the terms? So if you're a startup, I mean, it's a great opportunity. And if you're an AI startup more particularly that relies on data, to start this mapping day one, can accelerate deals because you can show this maturity when you get to due diligence and say, look, like, not only have we thought about data licensing and we look at it as a critical input and we're treating it as a critical input. So yeah, I mean, I think it's an opportunity with a clean slate to really bring your best foot forward, and it can be commercially really interesting to do that.
And to follow on the question there, the toolkit's going to be made available to attendees. So it's not published yet, but you'll get a copy. And to build on Paul's point, when you're working for an investor or an acquirer, the level of diligence on organizations across, data, privacy, cybersecurity has significantly ramped up as it's become such a critical part of assessing the value of a business, but also the risks of the business. Nobody likes paperwork, but being able to cross your T's and dot your I's on those aspects of your business is work you're going to either do now or in the heat of trying to get a deal done. So it's a worthwhile investment now.
Yeah, and I would add, I've been working with actually a group of VCs who are looking at what are the right questions that we should be asking about this. And one thing that I've noticed is that it's shifted from a due diligence item to really part of the deal evaluation process for, as Paul said, companies where the data is sort of at all key to their business model. And so this isn't a check the box compliance anymore. There's really first of all, an understanding from VCs about what the issues are, but also they need to see that it's being addressed and that it's being done in a sustainable way, or you're not even getting to the phase where you could fix it, because it's really about deal evaluation and not here are things that you're gonna have to fix after we go through this round.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, and that also comes with the fact that I think everyone's more savvy about what it costs to train AI models, right? And that you're doing all this this diligence and this governance work in order to avoid retrainings of models in a way that is not timely and is costly. I know, I think more generally we didn't want to do a deep dive on AI, but obviously in French we say chasser le naturel, il reviendra au galop, but which means chase the natural away, it'll come right back. And I think we're seeing a bit of that here. So don't hesitate to pull this conversation back to non-AI things, because there's still lots to do there.
Yeah, and I think we definitely want to leave space for questions as well.
Definitely, as they start coming in. I think also too, just kind of, things as you guys are talking about, are there things that you're seeing, for example, that data licensees aren't focusing on enough, or aren't thinking about enough, as you kind of think about some of these, sort of best practices and strategies to empower folks to think about?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important is, how the data inputs are going to change over time. So depending on the use case, you have to be really specific about, is the data getting refreshed? How often? If there are data changes that require, if there's something that changes in how the data is if there's something that changes that requires really a rewrite, are you getting the data in real time? Do you have to go broadly? Is the right scope of data being captured? Or is something that's not relevant now able to come in and all of a sudden your scope of data is going to be right? Then there's, what happens if the data format changes, right? So, we, for instance, when we're annotating data, we're on very specific instructions that have to do with how, the format of the data and how it's captured and the hardware that it's captured on. And so thinking over time about how things can change and what the notice periods are and what that change management process looks like is really important. Because if you're making a lot of investment in that data as it is now, then you really need to capture how it understand how it may change over time. Because the fact is, the collection methods, the legal the legal standing and the hardware is changing very quickly these days.
Yeah, I mean, I'd caution people on being overly optimistic about bringing in restrictions and managing them. Like I think for data, you know, you see restrictions come in like research, like you can use it only for research purposes. And at that time, people, you know, a team can be like, yeah, of course we're doing research. We only wanted to explore, see if it works. But then that can quickly shift. If it does work, what's the plan? And it might be okay that there is no plan at the time of signing it there, but at least you have to know that that research, the elastic of research exemption is going to break, and you don't want it to snap in your face, right? So I think that optimism in being like, oh, that's fine, we'll manage it later, or no, it's never going to happen, we're only going to use it for research. I think you have to kind of temper that and find a way to track these conditions and manage them. Sometimes like commercial, non-commercial, that's another one that's ambiguous, difficult to manage because not everyone has the same notion of what that means. For some, non-commercial is about the organization. So non-commercial would only mean, you know, non-for-profits or individuals, or I'd say universities, but then like some people will say, well, no, universities have commercialization activities and tech transfer offices. And so is that commercial, right? So I think it's a good example. Universities are showing that these purpose limitations shift within an organization as well, and in time also shift. So, I mean, it's not to sound defeatist, and I think oftentimes, you know, an organization might want to consider having clearer, you know, discussions with the data provider. If it's a critical asset, you might want to just grab the bull by the horns and negotiate it outright.
And Jade, can you maybe speak a little bit more, around the public data and some of those elements as well, kind of from your lens?
Sure, and I'll relate it to a point I wanted to make about things that I'd like to see organizations think about more, and that's more engagement with public policy on this point, so that policymakers understand what's actually happening in their own backyard and the things they're trying to regulate. So the example of we kind of talked about publicly available data, and our privacy commissioners have said, you know, things on social media are personal information. They're not exempt from privacy legislation, and in fact, even if you publish something on a platform knowing that it's going to go to a wide audience, that doesn't mean it's publicly available. It's interesting because part of privacy is about respecting people's autonomy over their own data, and so making sure that when they put data out there, they're not having their autonomy disrespected by having that data used in purposes they didn't intend for. But when you put information out there publicly, you kind of expect it's going to be used for certain purposes, and that's your autonomy in a sense is being disrespected if you can't put data out there and expect it to be used for useful purposes. The example on public policy I wanted to give is that I knew this was the case in some European countries, that I didn't realize Nova Scotia had done something interesting, but about 32% of Canadians are organ donors, have signed up to be an organ donor. Just 32%, so a third of the country. But in Nova Scotia, 95% of people are signed up to be organ donors. And the reason for that is they changed their model to opt out instead of opt in. And the polls had surveys had shown that most people want to be an organ donor, think it's a good idea. They just don't get around to doing it. I think when it comes to data, and when you kind of ask the ordinary person on the street how they feel about the use of their data for research purposes, people are often very willing to donate. But are they going to go organization by organization donating? Probably not, offering to allow access to their medical records, for example, for medical research. But if there is policy drivers that delineate the circumstances when you can do that, it gives a lot of confidence to people who have data and think there's a useful purpose for it. There is a question on data retention and whether you're legally required to have a data retention policy.
I have a practical aspect to this one. I think the question says like, oh, I'm a startup, should I have a data retention policy? Like first, it all depends on what kind of data you're processing, right? So if you're processing personal information, Jade will tell you that your privacy policy should have some form of notice about what you're doing to delete it, and that is based on personal information laws.
I'd also just add that there's a requirement that you only hold it for a period of time that's sort of linked to the purpose with which you're collecting it. So if you don't have a data deletion policy of some sort and you just hold on to it indefinitely, then you're going to be in violation.
So practically speaking, if you're a startup and you're going to be selling to other businesses, so if you're a B2B startup, you're going to enter into contracts where who you're selling to, if you have their data, they're going to ask you more increasingly complex questions around what are the security standards that you have in place. A quick way, well, it's not quick by any means, but a way to facilitate those negotiations is to go through certification processes like ISO 27001 or a SOC 2 Type 2. And those are security standards, right? That tell you these are the measures that this organization puts in place and it's audited. And here's a certificate that fast tracks those conversations and confirms that these are in place. And as part of these, a data retention policy is necessary. So all that to say that, do you have to publish it if it's not personal information? No, but are people going to ask you if you're commercializing or building a business off of their data, what your policies are? Yes. And if you have formalized processes that are audited against and policies that are audited against, that's even stronger. So practically speaking, you want to look into it and push your best foot forward, because in turn it'll facilitate deals. And if you're building a startup, that's what you want to be doing. You want to facilitate deals and get revenue.
I would just add that you may not be in a position where you can create a policy right now, but you're in a position where you can avoid painting yourself into a corner where deleting your data is structured so that it's really, really hard to do that. So if you can think about it now, if you can at least just have your data organized such that you know roughly how old a record is, or the nature of a record, that's not just everything being dumped in one place, you can empower yourself to delete that data when you need to, when you mature to that state.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
Another question I was going to ask you is sort of, beyond this toolkit, that we've spoken on today, and maybe you guys can, just take a moment to kind of share, sort of what that motivation was for, for each of you sort of collectively to contribute to this. Are there other sort of best resources you'd recommend, for folks that are on to stay current on this topic? That would be great. Jade, I put it to you first.
Oh, okay.
Let you answer.
So the motivation is to try and bring the bit of the privacy and cybersecurity angle, although I do the data licensing component in my ordinary life. To me, I think putting these tools out there and empowering sort of the broader sector sort of raises all boats. And I can work really hard to educate people within my organization. I can work on educating clients, or I can try to push things into sort of the discourse of things that were once sort of esoteric become common knowledge. I think, sorry to go back to AI, but how generative AI really sprung onto the scene and people really now have a decent understanding of what it is. By pushing things forward around data licensing, people can start to understand it and start to talk about it outside of legal and IT, and start to see it, in boardrooms the way we've seen with cybersecurity in the last few years.
Yeah, and I would add, like, there's so many. I think there's so many important conversations to have around like what's being used and how, and people have to really pay attention to it. But we still, like, it accelerated so quickly that we didn't have sort of a common set of, like, we didn't have common language. We didn't have like a common basket of, okay, here's the information that I have to have before even going into this conversation. And so, like, helping to develop a tool that just gets everyone to a minimum information level so that we can have these conversations intelligently and people can sort of know what's going on throughout the supply chain, just means that, like, everyone's job in this space is a little bit easier. And just from a, like, rights perspective, everyone is just a little bit more enabled to know what's being done with their data and ask those questions and understand sort of like what they're contributing to these tools that we're all seeing, right?
Yeah. And just to finish, I think, Misha and I had co-authored along with others, a paper that we really worked on this kind of data licensing issue in AI. We called it the Montreal data license. And that was like kind of really a deep dive into some of the issues that we discussed today. This was, already 5 years ago. And so when the invitation came to collaborate with digital, and, for us, like just this kind of public awareness is just so important. And I think it was great to collaborate, with Jen and Jade and the whole gang. It was really a really amazing group of collaborators. And we were just, I don't know, I don't know, Misha, speak for yourself. I'll speak for myself. And I just felt, lucky to be part of that conversation. And because every time we have it, right, it just kind of crystallizes a little bit more how I'm thinking about it. It brings new insights too. So yeah, it's been fun.
No, thank you. I know, and we're grateful for your contributions to that as well. Before I hand it back off to Ben to close us out, what is the one key takeaway that you want to leave the audience with today? To each of you. Paul, I'll start with you. We'll go in reverse order.
Was it because I looked phased and I didn't know? To be patient, with yourself and with your organization. These are really complex issues to wrangle, and start small and be patient, and that's how it gets done. It's a big piece to chew, and I think it's good to be just kind of mindful of that, but not overly stressed about it, and just take it, incrementally and step by step.
Misha?
I would say go see the tool. No, but like, the tool, I think it's really it's a checklist on how to have these conversations. I think the takeaway is that these conversations are important to have. Not all of the aspects of the conversation are important for every company, but I think there's probably something in there that's very relevant to the business of every company. And so, like, take some time out of your day to really think, okay, which are the questions that we need to explore or align on within our organization.
You're gonna have you're gonna have conversations with people you're licensing data to or you're licensing data from. Get used to talking to lawyers as well. We're not that bad, but becoming sophisticated at understanding legal advice around, particularly around risk, because in privacy everything is, back to the question about how broadly do you word your consents, is there's no right answer there. You have to understand what the risks are, what your risk tolerance are, and what your investment is in legal services, because you can spend infinite amount of money on compliance, but you have to be making strategic decisions about where the spend is worth it and where the spend is not worth it. In terms of resources, as I mentioned kind of at the outset, on digitalsupercluster.ca under resources, there are recordings of previous sessions, including our own from December of 2022 on the Montreal data license that is excellent. And I will second that. I was rereading the Montreal data license paper this morning, and it is still very good and provides that common language that will help you kind of cut through the jargon that I'm guilty of probably spewing.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Really appreciate it, carving out your time today with us. And with that, Ben, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to Paul, Misha, and Jade for such a great conversation. And that is a great transition, because this webinar was recorded as well and will also be made available on the website and distributed to all the attendees and registrants. And with that, everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.